What is anxiety? How would you describe it?
Yeah, so there's a spectrum of different anxiety disorders. Anxiety in of itself is an exhibition of different feelings and emotions in which a person feels overwhelmed. They feel as if though they can't cope due to just kind of living normal in normal everyday setting, having, for example, experiencing palpitations, experiencing, for example, induced nervousness, feeling overwhelmed, feeling that, for example, simple tasks are things that they cannot really are not really achievable. So having kind of a combined element of different physical symptoms that kind of make their functionality almost disappear because of things that they feel in their bodily sensations that make them not capable of really kind of doing or functioning quite normally. So I think probably that's one way I would describe it. More of a kind of definition based on how it would manifest in an obsessional disorders, I think, setting is one that really works or one that really manifests itself in terms of functionality. But yeah, so I think probably that's probably one way I would describe what anxiety is.
Is there anything you would like to add?
Like, look at it basically, even just by definition, it is just like a feeling of kind of like unease or worry about something, something that could happen in the future, something about the past. So as Mustafa saying, is that feeling of them, being overwhelmed with things. And anxiety is something that, everyone experiences to some extent. It's to what extent does it like affect our functioning? When it's dysfunctional, then that's when obviously we consider it to be, something worthy of like meeting the criteria of like an anxiety disorder, something worthy of being diagnosed, if you've had it for a certain amount of time. And I think we'll get into it, but like, yeah, there's a lot of like biology involved with it. The whole stress, fight, flight, freeze response. So yeah, anxiety it's a very common presentation in actually a lot of mental health disorders. So there's a lot of comorbidity, as they would say. You can find it in, like Mustafa mentioned, OCD. You can be people have depression and anxiety at the same time. Many other disorders, psychosis also. So anxiety, yeah, it's quite broad, but it is, if you look at basics, it is this kind of like feeling of like worried and unease, fear, yeah, like the stress of it.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what does anxiety look like. So you were mentioning about noticing somebody being quite worried, being uneasy, nervousness. And I guess I was just thinking, is it quite normal to have these sorts of symptoms? Because in certain situations that can happen, for example, or deliver a presentation or having a driving test. In them sorts of scenarios, you would feel perhaps slightly worried. So I'm just wondering, when does it become normal and when does it become a situation where it starts to impact us in our lives?
We all experience anxiety at some point. It's a case of when it is affecting our functioning. Like, for example, like if we're worried about something and we've been worrying about that, let's say for like, half an hour or something, and it's affecting our functioning to do something, that's when we consider like, okay, this is a lot of, like, this is extreme level of anxiety and this is not helping us. Anxiety is really, like, anxiety is helpful. We need to be worried at times for things. Imagine back in the day when humans were like on the savannah, if a lion is like coming at you, it would be completely normal for you to be stressed out and have a response of like, I'm scared, I'm fearful, and I want to survive. And then you have the stress response, which is the fight, flight, or freeze. And essentially what that means is, fight meaning you confront the situation, flight meaning you run away, and freeze, which is you kind of like, just are in shock, or you're shutting down, or you're frozen, or as animals do, they play dead. So that whole response in us is very normal. This is what the stress response is called. This is where we have a rush of hormones released, and like the stress hormone gets released, like cortisol and adrenaline, all this kind of stuff. So that is completely normal over a certain period of time. But if, let's say, like that hormone release is going on for much longer than a few minutes, that whole rush is meant there to be for a quick response. It's not meant to be there for, let's say, 10 minutes or half an hour. So that's when it's like, okay, this is not helping. This level of anxiety is not helping. And that's when we need to consider, okay, maybe we need to do something about it. Maybe we need help with it, whether it's through, through doing things to relax ourselves, prayer, or reading hadith or surahs or duas, and there's medication, anti-anxiety medication, or there's obviously therapy, and various other ways to help with anxiety. But when it's going on for too long and it's not getting us a successful outcome to a situation, this anxiety response, that's when we need to consider, okay, this is turning into more of a condition or disorder rather than the normal level of anxiety that we all have to deal with things.
I think you made a good point, Moise, about how it is normal and it can be functional. So there is like you mentioned, Mustafa, about being on the spectrum. So we all have anxiety. It's a very normal, natural emotion, and it can be really helpful in situations. So if you're about to drive a test, you're going to go into a situation and you need to complete that exam. You need that sort of fight and flight response, that stress response, to really get you into that zone of working really hard. So it helps in that sort of situation. And we are humans, so we're created to survive. So back in them days, it was functional. However, like you said, people use it in everyday situations, which then becomes harmful to us. So going out for dinner or having to go to a social event, people then become very anxious and they go into that stress response situation. That's where an example can be. And you also mentioned how it can become quite dysfunctional and it can lead to serious disorders or mental health concerns. And Mustafa, would you maybe like to share some of the symptoms, what you notice and how you sort of pick up on some of these symptoms when it becomes dysfunctional?
So, for example, usually that's quite common. It can vary from person to person, but usually one thing that would be quite common is a feeling of restlessness. So somebody who has, for example, an anxiety disorder, often it's characterized by a very overwhelming and almost unending feeling of restlessness, being in a constant state of worry, for example, having trouble concentrating, having trouble sleeping, for example, dizziness, experiencing heart palpitations. These are all really what I would describe as very common symptoms of somebody who has an anxiety disorder. And kind of really just reiterating a lot of what Moise mentioned, because it kind of really hampers our functionality. One way in which we can really understand that the person has anxiety is that we would kind of look at how much it's impacting their daily life or basic chores that they would do, basic and simple tasks that they would be able in normal circumstances to do, but they're not able to do anymore. So the level in which, for example, it hampers a person's capacity or capability to be able to do these simple tasks, it kind of gives us an indication as to the severity or complex nature of the anxiety. And also, kind of really being able to understand for how long of a prolonged period they've been experiencing that for, kind of really gives us an idea of how, or the severity of the anxious, the anxiety, pretty much.
I guess I'm just thinking about them symptoms and how agonizing it can be for some people just to be in that state, the palpitations, the worry, the constant thoughts in the mind, how that can impact a person. And it's not something that's visible, it's very invisible. And people don't really understand the impact it has on people and how deeper it can become as well. And on another level, I can hear how it can actually really help people. It's like your palms sweating as well. It's almost like our body is telling us that we're in a position that we need to sort of work through. It's sort of impacting us as well. So the opposite of anxiety is to sort of relax. And that's sort of a way of sort of helping with the palpitations and the sweatiness as well. I guess I was also thinking about in Islam as well. What does it say in Islam about anxiety? Is it allowed? Does it mean we're a bad Muslim if we go through anxiety? I was curious about your thoughts.
Maybe if I can add a little bit of information on that. I mean, from the Islamic perspective, it's very clear from many like Islamic, from like the Quran, even from the Hadith, that there have been moments where many of the prophets have experienced moments of anxiety. Like, for example, there's a verse in the Quran speaking about Musa alayhi salam, and when he was confronting Fir'aun, and it mentioned, for example, فَأَوْجَسَ فِي نَفْسِهِ خِيفَةً. So there was an overwhelming sense of anxiousness, fear, and all of these emotions when he was tasked with having to go to Fir'aun, somebody who was extremely powerful, who was a tyrant, somebody who was extremely dangerous, given the fact that Musa alayhi salam, for example, was somebody who was also wanted by Fir'aun. So, but that was also something that he requested assistance from Allah with. So one of the ways in which he was coping with that was his supplications that he would make to Allah and saying, "Oh Allah, give me strength and give me, and also give me support." So a support network, when he mentioned, for example, send also my brother Harun with me so that he can give me strength when I go to Fir'aun. So the one idea that we get from the Quranic context is the importance of always supplicating and always asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for help, understanding that you're human and these are very human experiences and a very human condition. And at the same time also being able to want to seek a support network, people who could help you in difficult moments, in difficult times, that can give you that support when you need, in order for you to be able to carry on and be able to do whatever task that you need to do in order for you to fulfill your objectives. So I think that's really an important element that, many of us, we read the Quran, but sometimes we don't necessarily read the context of what many of these stories that we're familiar with are. And one of the a misguided correlation that often happens is that there's a correlation between somebody, who has a disorder of some sort, like a mental health disorder, automatically is equivalent, or it correlates with them being a bad Muslim, or somebody who doesn't have trust in Allah, or somebody who doesn't have high iman or good iman in Allah. So I think one thing that the Quran and from the Islamic perspective can shine on us is that actually these are very human experiences. The Prophet ﷺ, when he went to when he was commissioned to prophethood, he mentioned how he was afraid. He went to his wife Khadija and he said to her, "I'm afraid about what's going to happen to me. I'm saddened. I'm grieved. I'm feeling grief." He had all of these different human emotions. But he didn't look at it as if though it's something that had a negative appraisal about who he was as a person or his relationship with Allah. It was just acknowledging it as an actually human experience. This is what I'm feeling, as opposed to it must mean that I'm therefore not close to Allah, or therefore that I am far away from His mercy, which I think unfortunately happens quite a lot in this Muslim, in many of our communities nowadays, where, automatically if somebody's unwell with a mental health disorder, it's not looked as if though it's a medical condition. It's automatically given, almost a label based on stigma that this person must be far away from Allah. Are they not praying? Are they not praying their salah on time? Are they not observing the religious obligations? So all of these are questions that often come up when a person goes through a mental health crisis, which I think maybe our job, I suppose, as people who are experts in the field, is actually, trying to kind of give the awareness that actually that's not the case. You could be somebody who's a practicing Muslim, somebody who's very close to Allah, somebody very observant, but at the same time, you could potentially experience these kind of challenges just like anybody else.
Yeah, I'm really pleased you said that, Mustafa, because there is a lot of clients I come across, people I come across who feel extremely guilty when they're going through these difficulties in their life, and then question themselves as whether they're good Muslims. And there's just, I guess there's not enough information or not enough understanding around, like you said, it can be based on experience. So if somebody's gone through an accident or if somebody's gone through a situation, it's very normal and natural to get anxious, to get worried. And the people who had the most highest of Iman, the prophets, peace be upon him, the Sahabas, they all experienced some element of worry or anxiety. And that was all circumstantial as well. So it was based on situations which evokes these feelings. It's very natural and normal to have these feelings, which is not related to how practicing you are or how strong your faith is. I guess I was also curious about if there's any cases either of you could share, being anonymous, of course, but maybe how did you work with it as a therapist? So what do you do when you're working with somebody who's anxious? Because you mentioned, Mustafa, about the spiritual side and sort of seeking Allah's guidance, absolutely, with giving dua, making du'as, so getting that sort of spiritual strength and also support. I thought that was really important, because when we are in these situations, we isolate ourselves, or we don't want to burden people. I think that's another comment that comes up. So it is so important that we have a wider network, as well as working internally. We also need to have that external support. Do either of you have any sort of scenarios, cases that you would like to share?
I could share, for example, one of my cases that I've worked with when it comes to anxiety. So there was somebody who had a very, I would say, complex and severe presentation of social anxiety in particular. And it kind of mainly really revolved around a masjid setting. And the reason why this individual had this kind of fear was because of they assumed that every time they go inside the masjid, they will be judged by many of the other people who go to the masjid, and simply because of the way his hair looked. So he used to like to braid it, and he felt like by doing that he can't enter into the masjid, and he, and just being in that setting kind of made him feel very, very anxious. But he mentioned he didn't want to go to the masjid. He does want to offer his prayers. He does want to, observe Jum'ah prayer like everybody else. And when I had a session with him, the first thing I kind of really wanted to understand was mainly what are some of the main presenting sensations that he feels when he goes inside the masjid. What is it that he really kind of feels? What is it that how would he characterize his own experiences? And he mentioned when he goes inside the masjid, he feels as if the spotlight is on him. He mentions, I feel bodily sensations all over my chest. I feel like my heart is racing. I feel like, I get the heart palpitations. I get all of these things. So these are some of the things that he mentioned, which are very characteristic of anxiety. So I looked at it from the perspective of, one thing we did was we formulated. So we went over many of the different things that he was experiencing. I put that all in a formulation, and then what we did was looking at it from the perspective of what do you think would happen if, for example, do you think your experiences would be different, for example, if you didn't have those braids? Do you feel like people would not be watching, would say something to, would not say anything to you, would not give you salam, or would give you salam more, sorry, if they would actually give you salam if you didn't, as opposed to what's going on maybe now? So he said, actually, I think people might give me salam. I feel like I'd be more accepted if I didn't. So I said, okay, we could do a behavioral experiment. And what we could do is we can see if if you put on an Islamic hat, for example, or you wear the Islamic shawl, maybe if there's a different reaction in the masjid, then maybe in those circumstances we can determine that actually, yeah, people are actually judging you for what for what they see from you. But then what the behavioral experiment actually revealed was that there was actually no difference whatsoever in the reaction of the other Musallin and the people who were in the masjid as to when he wore the Islamic garb and as opposed to when he didn't wear it. Meaning the exact same people that he would see in the masjid said, the ones who said salam to him before said salam to him again. There was not really any difference in the way in which they received him. So from that, he realized, actually, maybe I had a very strong belief. I created a belief about what people's perceptions of me were. And through this behavioral experiment, what it taught me was that actually those were beliefs that I've created that wasn't necessarily truth, wasn't necessarily factual. And when I actually tested and I experimented it actually proved to me that actually that was not the case. It wasn't necessarily people judging me. Probably most of the people who were praying did not really care about the way I looked, or what I wore, or how I presented myself. But people who I just happened to have developed a relationship with, continued to have that relationship with before and after I wore different clothing and different types of different types of prayer hats and shawls that in the masjid. So I think kind of that really tipped the balance in him realizing actually, I've created beliefs that perpetuated my anxiety that didn't necessarily need to be there.
So, yeah, amazing, Mustafa. And I can hear how he had a very fixed mindset. Like you said, he had this very particular belief, and it was very strong belief as well, that he would not be accepted if he went into the masjid with braids. And through that experiment, so getting him into the experiment, so really physically experiencing it really helped to broaden his perspective. And that helped him to recognize that his belief may not necessarily be true. Yeah. And Moise, what about yourself? Is there anything that you'd like to share when it comes to anxiety and Islam?
Yeah. Mustafa mentioned there about social anxiety, and what do you call? That's a very CBT approach, and I think the CBT approach can be very helpful for people with anxiety, because it essentially is helping you, because anxiety is like an emotion you're experiencing. That approach of like social experiments, it helps you to kind of engage not with as much like the emotional part of our brain, which is like the amygdala at the back of the at the bottom of the brain, but rather like the frontal lobe, the higher level consciousness, to think logically, like, okay, let me test this out. There's a what do you call, a phrase of taking your thoughts to court, looking at the evidence of it, rather than making assumptions. It's like, okay, let's test out our thoughts or assumptions, like we do that social experiment, like another thing you can do with a social experiment, which I've done with clients, is like again, I'll pick a social anxiety client, was like picking up on how many people give that person looks when they entered in an environment. you know, and counting that, like how many times they had looks and, you know, the before and after of it. Like Mustafa said about like wearing a hat or having the braids. And that helps you kind of tap into the logical part of your brain, and trying to see, okay, is there any, you know, trying to understand the truth of it. Is there any truth to my assumptions, to my thoughts? So that can be very helpful. And let me bring, like, yeah. So I had a client with social anxiety who had that, who got really worried about their colleagues. You know, he worked in a big company, and like he would have work meetings, and he would be worried of what people thought of him. And I think especially like for him, like he's Somali ethnicity, and he's like one of the only Black people in his company. So he had worries that other people are not listening to him, or that they have negative appraisals of him. And so we would do the same as Mustafa said, we would test it out. It's like, okay, notice next time what happens when you go into that environment. Do you notice people looking at you? Do you, you know, this whole like spotlight effect in social anxiety? It's like, okay, imagine if there was like there was like a camera that was like looking at you. What would it see? What do you look like? And trying to, you know, almost like remove yourself and understand, okay, what's happening here? Like connect with what you're feeling in your body sensations, your feelings, your thoughts, but test it out against the outside world, you know, other people. And so in therapy, what especially I would do in terms of techniques, like I use a lot of like, especially for people who worry a lot, or they consider themselves to be like a warrior. You know, we try to examine, it's like, okay, what are your worries usually about? You know, how often do you worry? How, for how long you worry? And we do something like using like a worry tree or like a worry diary, and helping them understand, kind of breaking it down again, like engaging with the logical part of your brain. Is like breaking things down, because I would say like there's only so much you can handle, keep in your head. There's only so much you can worry about before you get overwhelmed, right? Um, and so sometimes noticing what's in your head, what you're worrying about, writing it down is like, okay, in like a worry diary, like, okay, let me write down what the worries are for me, like at this moment, and what is the level of anxiety I have attached to those worries, like from 0 to 10. 0 feeling calm, 10 is like on the verge of a panic attack. And trying to understand, okay, is this a hypothetical worry, which means like, can I not do something about it? Is it something about the future? It's the classic what if questions. That would be hypothetical worries. Or is it like a current or practical worry? Like, is it something I can do something about? And then teaching them to like focus on one worry at a time, you know, um, because like we can't multitask too much. You know, there's only so much we can handle in our mind. And so going with that, like, yeah, like let's break it down and then work at one thing at a time, resolve that worry, and then move on to the next worry, rather than trying to do many things at once and not doing as good a job or resolving those worries, and then having those still going around in our mind. Yeah, hopefully.
But no, I completely agree with that approach. I think that was really helpful, and I think really kind of being able to identify specific fears and things that people find really anxiety inducing, I think would be really important to kind of utilize as part of a formulation. One thing that I've realized personally is that, you know, sometimes I think it helps patients just really being able to talk about some of those fears and going through them, because maybe I'll give you an example from an OCD perspective, because I work with OCD patients, is when it comes to the things that serve as a compulsion, they utilize those things to reduce their anxiety, to kind of make them feel quite, kind of at a level where they feel, somewhat, it's a short-term relief feeling of well-being. But anything that triggers their OCD, they go back into a spiral, for example, of needing to do something just to get that relief from the anxiety. So as a part of the work that I would do is I would get them to not respond to the urge or to the compulsion or to do a safety behavior or to neutralize, and just kind of get them to sit with the anxiety, as opposed to, necessarily trying to get rid of the anxiety. So sometimes for me, what's worked is actually, let the anxiety just be there, be with allow the anxiety to just continue and find a presence inside of you. The idea is that once the mind or the brain begins to understand, and I think it's when you spoke about the frontal cortex and the primitives, part of the brain. One thing that it requires is a long habitual type of learning, where it requires some time for it to be able to recognize that this is not a dangerous situation that I'm in at the moment. Therefore, the one way in which you would be able to recognize that is by not interrupting or interfering with the anxiety. So be anxious, be in a state of anxiety, and allow your brain to reinterpret the situation as one that actually, this situation I find myself isn't actually dangerous. There doesn't need to be a false alarm in this situation. I think that's probably one good experience that I've had, or that's kind of one thing that's been part of the work I've been doing with a lot of anxiety disorders, especially OCD.
Absolutely. And I think especially picking up on OCD, it is as it's called, the doubting disorder. It is and there's like you said, the compulsion is falling into that, doing the ritual, to reduce the any level of anxiety. And yes, it is a safety behavior. It's okay, I do this one thing, that means I can avoid that level of anxiety, right? For short term. But in a sense, you're not really confronting it, or you're not finding a solution for it. It's more like you just end up avoiding things. And with anxiety, there is a lot of avoidance, because you don't want to feel some people don't want to feel anxiety. They don't want to sit with it. They're scared. And that's what we're teaching our clients is no, it's okay. The more you, like you said, habituate, expose yourself to the anxiety, the more you sit with it, you realize, okay, it will pass. All emotions will pass, all thoughts will pass. So using that, helping them to, through experiments is okay, let's sit with it. Okay. Even as you mentioned with social anxiety, sometimes you can even create an anxiety inducing scenario inside the session if you can. And, trying to have them a live version of okay, how do we now sit with that anxiety, rather than doing rituals to be able to avoid that anxiety. And then they'll find more long-term ways of dealing with the anxiety, rather than having to constantly neutralize the scenario and running away and escaping. Because then again, it's that level of avoidance that doesn't really get them anywhere long-term.
That was nice what you guys were sharing, because you were sharing different approaches, different styles, different scenarios of how you work with anxiety. And I guess I'd like to add what you mentioned, Moise, is how people don't want to stay with them feelings. And I think that's a key part, is people don't want uncomfortable feelings. They want to run away from it. They want a quick fix as quickly as possible. And this is what maintains the anxiety. And this is why people avoid it. They'll do whatever they can to not feel them feelings. And one of the things I also do is I talk about, if you just stay with that feeling, just like a wave, it will get to a point or it'll get to its peak, and then eventually it will go down and it will subside. But like you said, it's having to support that person to manage that wave and get through it. And I think there is them thoughts that this is going to get worse, something really bad is going to happen to me, and hence why we have to sort of nip it in the bud, and then that gives it that short-term fix, as opposed to really overcoming the anxiety. Is there anything else that you both feel would be beneficial to share?
Yeah, I think like anxiety is something that can be misunderstood, like the topic we've talked about before, like depression, like, or like dismissed, even not necessarily just only in Muslim communities, but in, there is still a stigma towards mental health conditions or mental health symptoms. And just like we've talked about today, it's important to normalize anxiety disorders, and trying to also because then if you come to therapy, you can also understand where it comes from. Like anxiety is something you might be experiencing now, but there might be a whole history of where that comes from. Why do you react? What triggers you? And that's that's the more like psychodynamic. That's the more looking at the past and how it connects with the present. Why do we react like this whenever, let's say when we have family coming over and we need to make a dinner or something, and we're very anxious about, okay, they're going to come on this time or whatever, and and we're starting to lose our cool and getting the heart palpitations and stuff. And so anxiety is quite wide ranging, and we all experience it to some level. So normalizing it is important, and also just willing to understand if someone is very anxious, it's okay. We don't have to demonize it. We don't need to stigmatize it, because the more we do that, the more we try to avoid it or, share about it, the more it'll just be like Aisha, you said, invisible. The more it's just kept hidden and suppressed. And again, we just keep avoiding, like the symptoms of anxiety itself, we keep avoiding the source of the anxiety. And then at some point we end up blowing up and having like an outburst or having a panic attack or mental breakdown, whatever it is. And that can have also big consequences, that if we had people around us, a support network who understood what it was and also seek professional help if needed, that I think like things would be easier for people experiencing anxiety. They would feel okay to talk about it and okay to share, just like we share with any physical conditions like diabetes, cancer, all kinds of, we talk about it, and we normalize it, like, okay, and this is how we deal with it. Everyone has different ways of dealing with it, as we've talked about today. So the more we talk about it, the more we can understand about it, and the more we can try to deal with it and heal from it.
Yeah, I'll probably just reiterate a lot of what Muiz mentioned. It's a very, very human condition. Everyone experiences anxiety. There's nobody who doesn't have some level of anxiety, because it's something that's really built in our hardware. We're hardwired as human beings to have anxiety. It serves a function. It's there for a very important reason. Much of what Muiz already covered. The only time it becomes really problematic is if it becomes overwhelming, and if it becomes something that is not regulated and it shows up when it doesn't need to show up. Having said that, I think it's important just to remind people who make the association between not being a good Muslim and having anxiety, depression, and many other disorders, that actually that's not, there's nothing to worry about. It does not necessarily make any statement about your Islam. It doesn't mean anything. It doesn't translate into meaning anything specific in relation to your closeness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So I think it's kind of important to reiterate that it is very normal for somebody to have these types of illnesses, disorders, and they could still be a really good Muslim, and they could still be somebody who's really close to Allah. And in fact, sometimes maybe an argument could be made that somebody who goes through a tribulation like this might be somebody who's actually even favored, by Allah. From our understanding in the Islamic tradition is that somebody who's tested is somebody who's not somebody who's far away from Allah, actually somebody who's close to Allah. So I kind of really just want to normalize it, especially for people in our communities who believe that, or maybe have the wrong assumption, that it necessarily means, it might necessarily mean that they don't have good iman, or they don't have a good relationship with Allah. That's actually not the case. And if there's anything that they can take away from today, I think I'd wish that would pretty much be it.
Jazakallah khair. So two really key points for the audience to take away is essentially normalizing. It's very normal, absolutely normal to feel anxious, to have anxious days, to have good days, to not have good days as well. It's situation based, whatever experiences we go through. So normalizing it, talking about it like we talk about other health concerns. So really not eroding this stigma that's attached, that we can't talk about it. So really being okay with having anxieties. It's fine, it's normal, it happens in life. So really trying to get into that sort of zone, that mindset. And secondly, recognizing it has no connection to whether you're a good Muslim or not a good Muslim. So anxiety has no connection, whether that means you have strong faith or no faith. So I think they're the key points that is really important to take away. And hopefully, if you are going through anxiety, or you know somebody who's going through anxiety, please do try to take away some of these tips that Moise and Mustafa have shared with you. And also get in touch with a therapist. You can get in touch with Sakoon, sakoon.co.uk. There's other helplines, and we also have an app called muslimmoodfit.com, and they have a lot of features that can support you with anxiety and depression. But I just want to say thank you so much, Jazakallah khair, to Brother Mustafa and Brother Moise for your time and for your expertise, your knowledge, and your experience. And inshallah, we hope that you will benefit from some of what we've talked about today.